California in the 1970s was supposed to represent the American dream. Endless sunshine, quiet suburban streets, children riding bicycles until the streetlights flickered on, families leaving their windows open at night to let the cool Delta breeze drift through their homes. It was a time when people believed their neighborhoods were safe. But somewhere in Northern California, someone was watching. He moved silently through the darkness, studying houses like a predator studies prey. He learned routines, memorized floor plans, waited patiently for the perfect moment. Then, when the neighborhood finally fell asleep, he would slip inside, through a window, through a sliding door, sometimes even through a locked gate that should have made the home safe. No alarms were triggered, no witnesses saw him enter, and by the time the victims realized they were not alone in their own house, it was already too late. Between 1974 and 1986, California was terrorized by a criminal so methodical, so patient, and so invisible that police struggled for decades to understand who, or what, they were hunting. At first, investigators believed the attacks were the work of different criminals. A prowler stalking homes in Sacramento, a rapist who struck in the dead of night, and later, a killer who appeared hundreds of miles away along the Southern California coast. Different crimes, different cities, different victims, but the same chilling pattern, and the same terrifying realization. The monster had been there all along. For years, he had many names. The East Area Rapist, the original Night Stalker, the Visalia Ransacker, but the world would eventually come to know him by one name that captured the scale of his crimes: the Golden State Killer. This is the story of how one man managed to terrorize an entire state for more than a decade while hiding in plain sight, and how the hunt for him became one of the longest and most haunting investigations in American criminal history. Northern California, 1976. Sacramento County was growing rapidly as families moved away from crowded cities in search of quieter lives. New suburban developments stretched across the landscape, rows of identical homes, neatly trimmed lawns, and streets that looked almost interchangeable. It was the kind of place where neighbors knew each other's names, where doors were sometimes left unlocked, where the biggest fear most residents had was petty theft or vandalism. But late at night, something far more disturbing was happening. At first, the incidents seemed strange, but not necessarily connected. Residents reported hearing noises outside their homes, footsteps in the backyard, the faint sound of someone testing a window. Some people even reported seeing a shadow moving through their yard in the early hours of the morning. Police initially believed it was simply a prowler, but the truth was far worse. The man who would later be called the East Area Rapist was already perfecting a terrifying routine. He would spend days, or sometimes weeks, studying a neighborhood, watching, learning, waiting. He often chose middle-class neighborhoods where homes had sliding glass doors or easily accessible windows. He would creep through backyards late at night, checking which windows were unlocked. Sometimes he even removed window screens days before the attack, so he could return later without making noise. And when he was ready, he entered the home silently. Victims later described waking up to a horrifying realization. Someone was already inside their bedroom, standing in the dark, watching them sleep. He carried a flashlight and often a handgun, which he used to control his victims without immediately alerting neighbors. His method was chillingly consistent. He would wake the couple and force them onto the floor. The man was usually tied up first, often with shoelaces or cords taken from inside the house. Then he would place dishes or objects on the man's back. If the dishes fell and made noise, he warned, he would kill them both. It was psychological terror designed to keep the victims completely still. Then he would take the woman into another room, and the nightmare would continue. The attacks were brutal, calculated, and deeply disturbing, not only for the victims, but also for the investigators trying to stop him, because he left almost nothing behind. No fingerprints, no obvious witnesses, no clear suspects. But what frightened detectives the most was his level of preparation. He frequently cut phone lines before entering homes. He moved with confidence inside unfamiliar houses, suggesting he had studied them beforehand. And sometimes he seemed to know details about the victims' lives, details that suggested he had been watching them for a long time. Even more disturbing were the phone calls. Weeks or months after an attack, some victims would receive late-night calls. A whisper on the line, sometimes breathing, sometimes a single phrase spoken in a chilling voice. "I'm going to kill you." By 1977, the attacks were happening with alarming frequency across Sacramento County and surrounding areas. Entire communities began living in fear. People installed locks, alarms, and floodlights. Neighborhood watch groups formed. Gun sales increased dramatically, but none of it seemed to stop him. Because the attacker wasn't reckless. He was patient. He adapted. And he always stayed one step ahead of the police. Then, in a chilling development that stunned investigators, similar crimes began appearing hundreds of miles away in Southern California. But these were different. The victims weren't just assaulted. They were murdered. The killer had evolved. And the terror that began as a series of nighttime intrusions was about to become something far darker. Because the man who stalked California's suburbs wasn't just a rapist. He was becoming a serial killer. And the most terrifying part was this. No one knew who he was. No one knew where he would strike next. And somewhere, in a quiet neighborhood, behind the perfectly normal facade of suburban life, he was already watching his next victim. By the late 1980s, the trail had gone cold. For more than a decade, investigators across California had chased a ghost, an offender who seemed capable of appearing anywhere and disappearing without a trace. Police departments from Sacramento to Orange County had amassed thousands of reports, victim statements, and forensic samples. Yet none of it had led to a suspect. The man known as the East Area Rapist and the original Night Stalker simply vanished. No new attacks. No new leads, just silence. For the victims and the communities he had terrorized, the silence was almost worse than the crimes themselves. It meant the man responsible had likely blended back into normal life somewhere, possibly living among ordinary families, working ordinary jobs, walking down ordinary streets. And no one knew who he was. Over the years, detectives attempted to connect the scattered pieces of the investigation. The crimes had occurred across multiple jurisdictions, each with its own files and investigative teams. Early attempts to link the cases were slowed by the limitations of the era, before digital databases, before advanced DNA technology, before the kinds of national coordination modern investigators now rely on. But gradually, a clearer picture began to emerge. In the early 2000s, DNA analysis finally confirmed what some detectives had suspected for years. The East Area Rapist and the original Night Stalker were the same person. One man had committed dozens of assaults in Northern California before escalating into murders in Southern California. But the question remained. Who was he? Another clue lay buried even further back in time, years before the first known East Area Rapist attacks. In the mid-1970s, the quiet agricultural town of Visalia, California, had experienced its own wave of unsettling crimes. Residents reported a prowler who broke into homes at night, rifling through drawers, stealing small items, and leaving behind signs of a strange and obsessive pattern. Investigators eventually dubbed the offender the Visalia Ransacker. Between 1974 and 1975, more than 100 burglaries were attributed to the mysterious intruder. The crimes had a familiar rhythm, nighttime entry, careful movement through homes, and a disturbing sense that the offender had spent time studying his victims beforehand. At the time, the cases seemed unrelated to the later attacks in Sacramento. But decades later, investigators began to see the parallels. The prowling, the surveillance, the escalating boldness, and the possibility that the Visalia Ransacker had evolved into something far more dangerous. Yet despite the mounting evidence and years of investigative effort, the identity of the offender remained unknown. Detectives retired. Evidence boxes were moved to storage rooms. The case joined the long list of unsolved crimes that haunt law enforcement agencies across the United States. But one investigator refused to let it disappear. Paul Holes had spent years working cold cases in California, developing a reputation for patience and relentless attention to detail. By the early 2000s, he had become deeply involved in the hunt for the East Area Rapist, now increasingly referred to by a new name that reflected the full scope of the crimes. The Golden State Killer. Holmes understood something many investigators had begun to realize. Traditional detective work might never identify the suspect. There were no surviving eyewitnesses who could clearly identify him. No fingerprints tied to a known offender. No confession. But there was one thing investigators did have. DNA. Biological evidence collected from the original crime scenes had been preserved for decades. The genetic profile of the attacker was known with certainty. The problem was simple and frustrating. That DNA did not match anyone in the National Criminal Database, which meant the suspect had likely never been arrested for a crime serious enough to require a DNA sample. For years, the evidence sat in the system, waiting. Then, in the mid-2010s, a radical new idea began to circulate among investigators. What if they stopped looking for the killer's DNA and instead looked for his relatives? The concept was called genetic genealogy. It relied on the same type of consumer DNA databases used by millions of people searching for their ancestry. Individuals voluntarily uploaded their genetic information to online services in order to find distant relatives or trace family origins. One of those platforms was a small but growing website called GEDmatch. Unlike official law enforcement databases, GEDmatch allowed users to compare DNA profiles across a wide network of participants. And that gave investigators a new strategy. In early 2018, investigators uploaded the Golden State Killer's DNA profile, anonymized, into the GEDmatch system. They weren't expecting to find the killer himself. Instead, they were looking for partial matches. Distant relatives, cousins, family members who might share small segments of the same genetic code. Within hours, the system produced results. There were no close matches, but there were several distant ones, people who shared small amounts of DNA with the unknown suspect. For most people, such matches might mean nothing. But to genetic genealogists, they were the beginning of a trail. Investigators began building family trees. They traced marriages, births, and deaths across generations, sometimes going back to the 1800s. Slowly, methodically, they mapped out extended families connected to the distant DNA matches. It was painstaking work. Thousands of names, multiple branches, countless possibilities. But eventually, the family trees began to narrow. The investigators focused on male descendants who would have been the right age during the attacks in the 1970s and 1980s. The list shrank, then shrank again, until finally, one name stood out. A former police officer, a man who had lived in California during the exact years the crimes were committed, a man whose age matched the suspect profile. His name was Joseph James DeAngelo. For decades, the Golden State Killer had been an invisible predator. Now, investigators finally had a possible identity, but they still needed proof. Detectives quietly began surveillance. They followed DeAngelo, watched his house, waited for an opportunity to collect discarded DNA, something as simple as a tissue, a cup, or a piece of trash. Eventually, they recovered a sample. When the laboratory results came back, the answer was undeniable. The DNA matched. After more than 40 years, after thousands of victims, witnesses, investigators, and unanswered questions, the Golden State Killer finally had a name. Joseph James DeAngelo, a man who had spent decades living an ordinary life, raising a family, working as a mechanic, blending into suburban neighborhoods, while one of the most disturbing crime sprees in American history remained unsolved. On April 24, 2018, police surrounded his home in Citrus Heights, California. The long hunt was over, but the true shock of the case was only beginning to unfold. April 24, 2018. Citrus Heights, California. The neighborhood looked like thousands of others across suburban America. Quiet streets, trimmed lawns, aging pickup trucks parked in driveways. It was the kind of place where people waved to each other while collecting the morning newspaper. Nothing about the modest single-story house on Carriage Drive suggested that it was about to become one of the most infamous crime scenes in modern American history. For decades, the man living there had appeared completely ordinary. Joseph James DeAngelo was 72 years old, a retired mechanic, a father, a grandfather. To neighbors, he was simply the older man who sometimes worked in his yard or rode his bicycle through the neighborhood. Few people paid much attention to him, and no one suspected that inside that quiet house lived a man investigators had been hunting for more than 40 years. But on that morning, law enforcement officers moved into position. Surveillance teams had spent weeks monitoring DeAngelo. They had quietly collected discarded items containing his DNA, objects thrown away in the trash, things most people never imagined could become evidence. The laboratory results had confirmed it. The DNA matched the evidence preserved from crime scenes across California. The same DNA connected to dozens of rapes. The same DNA connected to multiple murders. After decades of uncertainty, investigators now knew the truth. The Golden State Killer was living in Citrus Heights, and they were about to arrest him. Shortly before the arrest, officers moved quickly. Police vehicles surrounded the property. Detectives approached the house. Within moments, Joseph James DeAngelo was taken into custody. The man who had once moved silently through dark neighborhoods, breaking into homes, terrorizing families, vanishing into the night, was now standing in handcuffs under the bright California sun. There was no dramatic chase, no desperate escape attempt, just an elderly man being led away from the quiet life he had carefully built around himself. When the news broke, the reaction was immediate. Across California and across the United States, people struggled to process the revelation. For decades, the Golden State Killer had been imagined as a shadowy figure, a criminal mastermind, a predator who somehow remained invisible. But the man now accused of those crimes looked nothing like the monster people had imagined. He looked like someone's neighbor, someone's coworker, someone who might have stood behind you in line at the grocery store. The shock spread quickly through Citrus Heights. Neighbors began speaking to reporters, trying to reconcile the man they thought they knew with the crimes now associated with his name. Many described him as quiet. Some said he could be irritable or withdrawn. But none of them imagined he could be responsible for a crime spree that had terrorized an entire state. The revelation that DeAngelo had once worked as a police officer only deepened the sense of disbelief. In the early 1970s, he had served as a police officer in the town of Exeter, California. Later, he became an officer in Auburn, the very profession dedicated to protecting communities, the same profession that had spent decades searching for the Golden State Killer. To investigators, this detail was both chilling and deeply revealing. It explained his knowledge of police procedures, his ability to avoid leaving evidence, his understanding of investigative techniques. For years, he had been operating with the insight of someone who knew exactly how law enforcement worked. But eventually, even the most careful criminal can leave behind something. In this case, it was DNA. And DNA does not forget. Following the arrest, prosecutors began assembling one of the most complex criminal cases in American history. The evidence spanned decades, multiple counties, dozens of crime scenes, countless victims. Many of those victims had waited their entire adult lives for answers. Some had lived with the fear that the man who attacked them might never be identified. Others had doubted that the case would ever be solved at all. Now, at last, they would have a chance to face the man responsible. During the court hearings that followed, survivors and family members of victims delivered emotional impact statements. Their voices carried the weight of 40 years. Some described the fear that had followed them through their lives, the anxiety, the sleepless nights, the constant awareness that someone had violated the safety of their home. Others spoke about loved ones who had been murdered, lives that had ended violently and without explanation. For many, the courtroom represented something they had almost given up hope of seeing: justice. Joseph James DeAngelo eventually pleaded guilty to multiple counts of murder and dozens of additional charges related to the assaults. The plea agreement ensured that he would spend the rest of his life in prison. But for many victims, the legal outcome was only part of the story. What mattered more was the truth. For decades, the Golden State Killer had existed as a terrifying mystery, a phantom who moved through communities without a face or a name. Now the mystery had been replaced with a reality, one that was perhaps even more unsettling. Because the monster was not some mythical figure hiding in the shadows. He was a man who had lived among ordinary people for decades. A man who attended barbecues, who raised children, who paid taxes and worked regular jobs. A man who blended into everyday life so completely that no one around him suspected what he had done. And it was not traditional detective work that finally revealed him. It was technology, genetic genealogy, an investigative method that did not even exist when the crimes were committed, had succeeded where decades of investigation had failed. By tracing fragments of DNA through distant relatives, investigators were able to reconstruct a family tree that eventually led them to the man responsible. It was a breakthrough that changed the future of criminal investigations. Since the arrest of the Golden State Killer, similar techniques have been used to solve numerous cold cases across the United States. Cases once believed impossible to close. Mysteries that had lingered for decades. But the story of Joseph James DeAngelo also raises a darker question. If one of the most prolific serial offenders in American history could live quietly in a suburban neighborhood for 40 years without being identified, how many others might still be out there? How many unsolved crimes still sit in evidence rooms, waiting for technology to catch up? And how many monsters are still hiding in plain sight, living ordinary lives while the truth remains buried in the past? For the victims of the Golden State Killer, the nightmare lasted decades. But in the end, time and science finally caught up with him. And the man who once believed he could remain invisible forever was forced to face the one thing he had avoided for most of his life: the truth.